wild fish populations and what options it should consider to help recover them, and to make sure that hatchery operations do not negatively impact that recovery. Considering the huge cost of hatcheries, shouldn't more of ODFW's effort be focused on improving and publicizing opportunities for wild fish angling?
It's a pretty broad-ranging question. I think the answer at a high level is we try to do all of that. We try to, a lot of our agency effort is spent addressing issues that are plaguing wild fish in terms of habitat, hydro harvest, and hatcheries. And there's been a lot of work over the years to make sure that hatcheries are good neighbors to wild fish, and that's reflected in those policy frameworks that was one of the contractors' reviews. And in terms of making sure they continue to be good neighbors to wild fish, that's where these different policy venues and work with our commission come into play, and that's where the public has a role in engaging with us in the commission and the development and revision of those policies. So for example, the Coastal Multi-Species Plan was put in place in 2014. It gets revisited starting in 26. That's a place where we'll all engage again in a discussion about wild fish and hatchery fish. The Rogue South Coast Plan was just put in place 2022, I think. Again, that same discussion happened with people and with the commission about how we're kind of managing hatchery and wild fish and what we're doing to address some of the limiting factors for wild fish. And there's various kind of recovery plans, particularly in the Columbia River Basin, that have those conversations. So those will be ongoing. And as to your piece about will there be a specific effort looking at wild fish values similarly to this, we don't have any plans for that currently. Typically, those processes occur with like a adoption of a regional geographical management plan, like the Coastal Multi-Species Plan or Rogue South Coast. And the next one's coming up starting in 26. Hopefully I got all the different elements of that question.
Thanks, Sean. Kellen, did we catch up on the questions that were coming in from the online crew?
We did. As far as ones that were entered in the chat, I will just say that Dave did ask about the survey with some specific questions about who and when, but I said we would be getting to that this afternoon around 2 o'clock-ish in case anyone else is curious.
Great, that sounds good. Chris, whenever you're ready. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about the small group process. So we're in the large group now. There was also in parallel a small group process, which gave us a chance to have a little bit of focused conversation with fewer people around the table, so we could go a little bit deeper. And by a little bit deeper, I believe we had 5 6-hour meetings, so about 30 hours of time together. And we did some one-on-one conversations as well. And if you can go to the next slide, Chris, I'll show you all again who was in the small group. So these are the organizations that each had one person present at the small group conversation. And you know, the focus here was to get a range of perspectives and folks with both local and statewide perspectives to bring into the conversation. The format of the conversation was really an opportunity for these groups to talk to each other in front of the department and for the department to answer some specific questions like they have here in the room about the work of their contractors, the alternatives that were being considered, other technical questions that folks would raise in the room, like, is it possible to do X or Y or Z? The department would be able to answer that. But the real benefit was sort of having folks meet each other, talk about their perspectives, and share ideas with each other, and the department benefited from listening to that group share ideas in that way. The idea behind the small group is that between each of the meetings, the representatives of these groups could go back to their members or constituents and sort of say, hey, here's what we talked about. Here's where the conversation was headed. Do you have any feedback? And to help with that effort, we posted notes between each of the meetings to the best of our ability. Occasionally there was a little bit of lag time, but there are now notes for every single meeting online, so that people could sort of be tracking the topic as they came up and the small group discussed. So that is the sort of format of the small groups and the actual participants. Does anybody online or in the room have a question about who was there? We're going to dive into the work of the group here in a second. All right. Can we go to the next slide? And I'll go ahead and do this one, Kellen, and then you want to start with the factors after this. So one of the exercises that we did in this group was to brainstorm factors that the small group members thought were important to decisions around how to or whether to invest in certain facilities or programs. And so we're going to dive into each of these factors, but wanted to give you at the high level the list the group came up with, which were environmental conditions, wild fish, hatchery performance, local community value and economics, and hatchery cost. And the benefit of this small group coming up with a list of factors is that, as you heard Sean and Chris talk about earlier, the third-party contractors did, they considered a subset of factors, but there are limitations, as you heard, particularly around economics, in how you go about valuing local economic benefit, right? You all had tons of questions about that. And this was a place where the values that you have that may not be easily captured by an economist or easily captured by scientists who are looking at these questions, you could have input here into the local values and economics, or any of these factors actually, that are particularly important in your community or to you or to specific groups. So it was really to sort of put some flesh on the bones of the factors that were being looked at already. All right, let's go to the next slide. And Kellen and I are going to do some back and forth here.
Thanks, Teresa. So here we have one of the factors, environmental conditions. And I'm not going to read every single bullet on these slides, but I just want you to see how these will be formatted as we go through them. You have the factor on the top, you have the considerations that led to this factor, and then data that is currently existing or needed on the right. And so I want to call out just that top bullet for environmental conditions, that is water quality, specifically temperature here. That came up frequently in conversation. And this also sort of reflects the general carrying capacity that was also a consistent topic that was discussed when thinking about these factors. I'll pause for a minute so folks can read this slide and sit with it, and then please ask clarifying questions. Again, we'll ask to hold comments for now, but if there's a word in here or anything like that that is you would just like a little bit of context or further meaning, then please feel free to ask in the room, put it in the chat, or raise your hand and we'll address it.
And I'll just say, as we move through these, you can picture the factors as sort of the set of considerations, and I know we use the word considerations here, but that have to be taken into account and weighed against each other as decisions are made. That's how the small group was thinking about it. And so sometimes these factors might be at odds with each other. Sometimes they may not. The idea is that if you think about all of the factors as you're deciding whether or not to invest in a particular facility or to make a different program decision, you would have a sort of wholesome consideration of what matters as you're making that decision. So as Kellen said, this one is environmental conditions. If you can go to the next slide, we'll show you the next one, which was wild fish. We had a long conversation about this factor because as the group was considering investment in hatchery infrastructure or facilities, it was very easy to consider like how much would it cost and how's the hatchery doing and what does the hatchery need. It gets a little bit more, you have to think a little bit more broadly, I think is what I want to say, when you want to take into account wild fish. And so that's why you see a really long list of considerations here. So what's the current abundance of wild fish? What are the abundance trends? What's the projected abundance when you take into account climate change? What's the diversity or distribution, listing status? So there are lots of considerations when you're thinking about wild fish. And then there's a set of data that the group came up with that's either available or needed to really assess how wild fish are doing in any particular area. And again, I won't read it to you, but I'll give you a minute to sort of take that in because I know it's a lot of information. And again, if you have any questions, if any of this doesn't make any sense to you, you don't know what a creel survey is or a carcass count or what is meant by productivity, let us know. Yeah, we've got a question, a couple questions in the room. Let's see, where did that mic go? Where is it?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I see here that you've got, considerations like projected abundance with climate change and spatial distribution and stuff like that. Is this stuff that's theoretical or stuff that you actually have data on that you're thinking? So these are just considerations people have raised, but we don't necessarily.
The considerations were sort of, I would describe the considerations as ways to understand the factor. So if the factor is wild fish, how do you go about considering the status of wild fish? And that's where the considerations come in. And then the data is a mixture, I think, of data that's readily available and data that is desired.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And we have two back here. We have a couple more questions in the room.
Just a quick question on the previous slide. I'm still coming to understand the relationship between the considerations and the data, but one of the considerations was food, or habitat food, but I didn't see data that was attached to that. So I was just wondering, what data would you fill that in with?
I am going to let someone from the department answer that question, if it's known.
I can answer that. This exercise was not meant to be a completely exhaustive list. So in some cases, there were considerations that were identified that there are other data sources that you could identify. But so I wouldn't consider it, this was a process of the group working through these questions, and it wasn't necessarily meant to be completely exhaustive. And I think there are other things that could be added to this.
Yeah. And one more question here.
Your definition of a wild fish, could they have had hatcheries as parents?
The question, do you want to repeat it?
Yeah, the question is what you're considering a wild fish, could they have had hatchery fish as parents? Yeah, could they have had hatchery fish as parents?
We're going to let Sean answer this one.
So these were kind of considerations that were being shared by members of the small groups. I'm sure each member of that small group might have had a different definition for how they think of wild fish. And really that wasn't for the department trying to find what that is, but some understanding from individuals in that small group that wild fish, however you define them, were important.
We're gonna do one more question in the room, then I'll come to you, Kellen.
So when we're trapping steelhead and we have high waters, any fish that are coming up toward our trap go over and can go up and naturally spawn. Therefore, if they have offspring, they're unclipped fish. There could be clipped fish when they went up, but any of the offspring are going to be unclipped. So that's something to think about here. When you're trying to look at your native fish, they may be escapement that went up.
Yeah, understand that. And again, these are like the perspectives of the folks contributing in this group. So how they think about wild fish, what it is, again, not the department's necessarily definition of a wild fish.
And we didn't engage in a discussion defining wild fish in the group. We worked on the factor that you see there, so that conversation hasn't happened. Kellen, do you want to answer or ask a question online?
Yeah, could you actually go back to the environmental conditions slide for this one? Thank you. So the question is, was water quantity limited by minimum flow requirements when assessing potential for investment?
So this is distinguishing between the department's analysis, or actually the third party's analysis of water quality, where they looked at what the water rate was, what the available flow was, and what the demand at the hatchery was. So that's quantitative looking. Here, this is the members of the small group saying that they think environmental conditions in some way, shape, or form should be a factor the department considers when prioritizing investments. And one of those considerations is water quantity and quality. It's not saying anything about how you might apply that factor to these things, just saying that in some way, shape, or form we should consider it. And I think the next step is like, well, how do you bring that into the decision making? Do you invest in hatcheries where there's already good water, or do you invest in hatcheries where the water quality is limiting and you want to try and address that? So this is just saying it's an important thing to consider, and the next step is how do you bring it in?
Thanks, Sean. Anything else online, Kellen? No. Okay, so we did environmental conditions and wild fish, the third factor.
Yeah, so here we've got hatchery performance. And this is really just assessing how fish are sort of raised and reared and every aspect of that in the hatchery, and what's the quality. And so right here you'll have like the size and capacity of the hatchery itself, and in here we factored in a consideration of that is there potential for expansion. You'll see required technology. This speaks to what are the improvements that maybe need to be made to make that hatchery or facility the most modern it can be. There is an assessment of programs, and also I want to call out the geography of the watersheds of release and capture here. And then related to that are some acronyms that we got very familiar with over this project. PHAS, which if Liz is in the room, she will laugh at me, but I'm pretty sure that stands for percent hatchery on spawning beds. And then we have SARS, smote to adult ratios, as well as some other data points here. So I'll pause there if folks have clarifying questions.
So I think this factor, I'll just make this comment, was a little bit easier to take on in some ways because the department's contractors were already looking at aspects. This one has aspects of this factor. This one has a fair amount of overlap with some of the work you all saw this morning and that you'll see in the reports. But this is sort of an expanded list, I would say, from what they looked at that the small group thought was important to consider. I see a question online, so I'm going to go ahead and read that while I have the mic. Was it noted that in some circumstances, policies under the guise of wild fish conservation have greatly reduced productivity of some of these facilities? Thank you, Ty. I would say that there was robust conversation in the room about sort of the relationship between hatchery and wild fish and different perspectives around how hatchery fish impact wild populations, and policies around wild populations might affect hatcheries. So yes, that topic was discussed. Any other questions? I also want to invite any of the small group participants, if you have observations or comments from your experience that you want to share that you think would be useful to the group, please do. There are some of you online and some of you in the room. All right, let's go to the next factor. Hatchery cost. So for this group, and again, you have the department's contractors who also worked on cost. But for this group, the considerations that they were thinking about were sort of the cost of whatever infrastructure upgrades are needed, the cost of maintenance, the cost of operation, and the opportunity cost, which is this idea that if you spend your money here, you can't spend your money elsewhere. So folks wanted to capture that as well. And then on the data, it's pretty straightforward. What are the costs of the upgrade? What are the annual costs of operation and the annual costs of maintenance? And again, this factor has pretty significant overlap with the department's contractors' work. Any questions on this one? All right, next factor.
So then we have local community value and economics. And this factor was very, very important to many folks, if not all folks. And it really focused on some of the more or the less tangible aspects of the fishing impact on a community. So this can be a cultural significance. This can be the impacts to the local economy. There's also an element of non-fishing recreational participation. How many folks are going to a community that is maybe, river adjacent or fishery adjacent and experiencing that and spending their money and participating in that community, but doesn't necessarily go fishing. But the fact that it is there brings in that value. We also heard a lot of educational value regarding these facilities and their relationship with either, volunteering or community service programs like STEP, in addition to actual education, like teachers can interact with these facilities with their students. It's a real community space and value. We also recognize on the data side of this that not all of this is measurable. Some of it is, for example, if folks are tracking their volunteer time, but we also know many folks are not, and we don't have good numbers on the number of folks that are visiting, but not necessarily making connection between, I came here because of this fishery or because of this river and I'm spending my money here. That can get a little bit more detailed. So this one is tough to measure, but it doesn't reduce its significance and its value. Any questions on that or more to add?
I would just add, I think this is the factor we probably discussed the most in the small group, and the factor that came up a lot as we were applying the factors to the department's alternatives. This is where the small group members were really able to bring, we'll call it local color and knowledge about specific areas. Like, oh, everybody really likes to fish from the bank there. This particular access ramp is really important. This is a great place to start fishing before you have a boat. This is a really important place to fish early in the season and figure out how the season's going to go. So all of that kind of value was really present in the room. Any questions? That is the sort of factor exercise. And then we're going to move into application of factors to the alternatives. So I'm going to pause here and see if anybody has questions on factors. We have a question here in the room. I can repeat it for you if you want.
Maybe for those that were in the small group or involved in the process, it's really clear what the relationship is. Being new to this, I'm not clear with how you use the data to make the decisions and maybe you'll go into the next step. For example, were these data made available? Just a list of things that you would have that data and or,
So the question is, not being familiar with the small group process, kind of how did the data play in? When was the data available when the small group was considering the alternatives, or is this just a list of data that folks thought would be important for the department to consider when they do their own decision making? Because remember, the small group wasn't engaged in decision making, they're just engaged in conversation. I would say the latter. Not all data was available. Some folks in the room have had access to data that they shared. In some cases, the department had access to data that they shared with us. In particular, the data that you saw this morning was kind of posted up around the small group room, but not all of this data was available. It was really intended to be kind of a first cut at, if you really wanted to look at data that bears on local community value, you should definitely look at these data sources. Does that make sense? I see Larry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I just, for the folks in the room and online, I think it's important. I saw Larry Phillips, American Sport Fishing Association, and I was on the small group of 10. And I just want to share that from our lens, this is really a focal point of what the exercise was all about. And I say that it's not that we're disregarding the commitments that we have and continue to have toward both ESA and wild fish, because we believe we thought and we still feel that those processes are parallel and those are occurring, and that the current operation of hatcheries is consistent with the agency's commitment to wild fish and ESA. So really the challenge that faces us all is that the agency, the state, the legislature, the governor's office has not made the investment in the hatcheries that are necessary to mitigate the impacts of the past, and that is the continued need for hatchery production. So from our lens, this is really one of the most important parts of this exercise that we did. Again, we believe that the hatcheries that currently exist in the state of Oregon are necessary. And this is the value system that we used to move us forward with tough decisions, assuming, we don't have additional resources, and assuming that we're going to want to continue to try to make the most out of the existing program that we have. So, not really, no question, but more of a statement. This and the infrastructure exercise that the agency went through with the consultants. So I appreciate all the work we've done, and continue to look forward to having this additional conversations about these pieces of this moving forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Bill, I see your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just really actually need to get behind 100% what Larry was getting at with that need for the overall existence of the, hatchery fish and the importance thereof to not just fishing communities, not just, anything else, but the overall big matrix of society and the whole thing.
Thanks, Bill. I think you're cutting out a little bit. Are you finished? Yeah. Are you finished?
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Technology
That's
got the
okay.
best of me inside my vehicle. Anyways, that's why we're listening to these things and doing these things. And we really appreciate your guys' efforts to explain it and make it aware for all of us. So it's really great.
Thank you. The other sort of point I think that came out in the small group process, and we're going to dive a little bit more into the work they did, is the factors were a way for the, us, the department, the group, to think about the decisions that are before the department now, but also in the future. And that part of the exercise, I'm kind of echoing Larry a little bit, felt really useful because there is the set of alternatives that we're about to discuss that are sort of up for decision in the shorter term. But the department is busily working on a roadmap for the future that will span, 20 plus years. So there are, tens and hundreds of decisions to come. And I think the factors are useful in that future decision making. And the exercise of applying them to the short-term decisions sort of gave us a little bit of information about what does it look like to try to use these factors as the department makes decisions. And we'll share some of those findings with you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we actually have a handout of this. I'm gonna get it going. And for the folks online, maybe we're gonna share a PDF with you at some point. Okay. So you've already seen these alternatives during Sean's presentation. We're handing them out so you can, here in the room, so you can have a closer look, and sharing a PDF with folks online so you can look more closely at your computer if you want. But these are the alternatives that this small group applied the factors to as sort of that initial exercise and applying it to the decisions immediately before the department. And we did not apply the factors to the status quo alternative because that alternative is investment at all facilities. It isn't kind of one of the more difficult decisions that's before the department right now. So we applied the factors to 2A, 2B, and 2C, and we split the exercise into Northwest and Southwest. So we first did it with the Northwest alternatives, which were the 3 different alternatives, and then we did it in the Southwest. And if you'll remember, the Southwest is the same alternative through all 3 of these options. So the Southwest discussion actually turned into a little bit of dreaming up new alternatives that aren't listed here, and we'll talk about that in a second. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Oh, what's happening? Oh, we're having a technical difficulty. Hold on. Yeah. Oh, okay. We're going to work on sending you the PDF in the chat, but we're going to keep going through the slides while we're doing that. So poor Chris is going to keep multitasking. Oh, one sec. Thanks, Chris. So here's an example of what we were doing. We took the 5 factors that we just stepped through with you and applied them to, in this case, the example is showing you the Southwest, kind of in bigger print. And I would say the small group spent 2.5 of its meetings working on this exercise. So we have more findings than what I'm about to share with you that will be included in Willamette Partnership's report, but we've got the high-level findings here coming up next. Go ahead. And Kellen, did you want to jump in on any of these, or do you want me to keep going?
Go ahead and keep going. I'll chime in if I want to add.
Okay. So some general learnings to start with, and the box that's over in the sort of topo map is kind of intended to be more factual matter. So just saying the factors are a community-informed set of considerations that were used as a starting point for ODFW's future conversations and decision-making. That is the proposal of the group. Our general learnings, and I'm sure you thought this when you were looking at the factors, how a party or the department prioritizes the factors really matters as you apply them. And being explicit in describing how they were prioritized is really important to understanding how a decision was reached, right? If you were just to say, we applied all 5 factors and this is the decision that emerged, that's not very helpful. If you say we applied all 5 factors and the factor or the consideration that emerged that was most persuasive or most important to us was, fill in the blank, and this is how it was thought about, that is a more helpful description of the factor application process. The other thing that we learned is you can apply the same factor and prioritize the same factor and come out with different outcomes that make sense to you, depending on your perspective. A really good example is this idea of, Sean raised it earlier, cold, clean, abundant water. That is both a place that a hatchery would do very well and a place that wild fish would do very well. So you might reach different conclusions about what should be done in a space that has cold, clean, abundant water. So being very clear in sort of the prioritization of the factors and the way that they were applied to reach a certain outcome is going to be critical for transparent decision making. The other thing that we learned, and I kind of gave a nod to this before, factors are useful when considering geographies and facilities, which is what we just went through as a small group, but they could also be applied to higher level policy and program decisions. And those higher level decisions will certainly come up in the next 20 years. So, the group in conversation talked a lot about not just using factors for infrastructure decisions, but using them for policy and program and budget decisions. Next slide. So this was the Northwest, where we were comparing alternatives 2A, 2B, and 2C. And to start, with the more obvious statements in the topo box, each alternative, and Sean said this earlier, presents trade-offs between financial savings, community impacts, and long-term sustainability goals. The other fact that came out in conversation with the small group was the system can currently only accommodate shifting production from one facility while maintaining production levels. So this exercise was within the sideboards of maintaining production neutrality. And so if you are going to maintain production neutrality or maintain production levels as they are, you couldn't choose 2 of the alternatives, because group members asked about that. How about we do 2A and 2C? Or how about we do 2B and 2C? And they wanted to sort of mix and match, but this fact emerged, which is within the confines of production neutrality, you can't shift production away from two facilities. So when we had a pretty robust conversation about 2A and 2B and a little bit less conversation around 2C, which was interesting and maybe a product of who was in the room. That was what some folks suspected. So with respect to 2A and 2B, I think everybody recognized that fisheries in both basins, as they're currently run, have challenges with performance, and access, but there was a big community value in the Nehalem Basin, in part related to the disabled access there. And there was a big challenge to relocating production for Salmon River because of the Pacific Salmon Treaty indicator stock that is there. So those sort of trade-offs came up. The handicap access ramp, the indicator stock, and then there was also future habitat value for wild fish was very high in the Nehalem. So those are sort of the considerations that emerged when comparing those two options. With 2C, everybody recognized that based on the department's data that it got from its contractors, the capital cost savings were the highest with 2C. But there was also a recognition that there's strong local support for winter steelhead there and an important early season steelhead fishery there. So it was interesting to hear those perspectives. And in particular, this is a great example of why community conversation is very helpful. I'm not sure the access ramp, the sort of focus on an early season steelhead fishery, those kinds of considerations are really in the purview of the public and kind of in your experience to share it back with the department. So it was very helpful. Any questions before we go to the Southwest? One question in the room.
On 2C, shifting production to trout, did you look into turning trout over to a private organization?
The small group did not. The question in the room was on 2C, shifting production to trout, which I think might actually be common to all of the 2A, B, and C. Did we look at shifting trout production to a private entity?
Yes.
The small group did not discuss that. I'll let the department answer whether they've considered that.
Yeah, in this analysis, there's no change in production ratios between trout, salmon, steelhead. It's assuming status quo. So same number of trout being reared, same number of salmon, steelhead. In terms of the shifts you're looking at in these alternatives, it's really shifting where they're being reared. So a lot more focus of rearing trout in facilities like Oak Springs, Fall River, and in the valley here, like Roaring River, and taking them out of some of those coastal facilities to accommodate some of the shifts. There are very few private producers in Oregon. I think there's a couple. One, I think, in the valley here is actually not operating at the moment. So there's one over the hill. And if you were to change or take trout out of ODFW's facility and produce them somewhere else, the money has to follow that. And currently it's cheaper for us to produce in the state system than to purchase them outside. So if that was happening, you'd have a net loss of number of fish from the system to accommodate a higher price.
Give me those figures, Chandra, because I've heard both sides, not arguing or anything, but I'm curious about that. I've heard both sides. So that...
Yeah, and it depends. Like you saw, the costs to produce trout vary depending on the hatchery they're coming from and the area they're serving. So it would depend on where you're going to take those trout from in the state system and put them somewhere else. And then there's other factors that go into it too. So if you like to help us narrow down on what information specifically you're looking at, we can follow up.
Desert Spring has quoted some very cheap prices, and I know trout going around. Probably not pronouncing it correctly, but it's a sterile trout they put in, so it's not going to have an impact on any of our native fish.
Yeah, it's triploid trout, and we stock a lot of those too. And again, for us, it's an issue of you've got a limited pot of money. If you're going to shift it out of the state system into the private system, that has repercussions for how the state system can continue to operate, because most of our costs tied up in production are with people. And if you are taking out of a sense else, or afford to, so it's complicated, I guess.
Thank you.
We have another question in the room.
Yeah, I just wanted, I was by the salmon communicator and the salmon line, if there's any ability, which was so I was wondering if you could explain that in the kind of small group on here.
Yeah, it's just like under this proposal, it assumes that program would still continue. But like I said earlier, it does become challenging to maintain programs in those areas. And so long term, if you weren't going to have a facility there, it would make more sense to try and transition that stock to a location where you could keep that infrastructure for surveying the basin, for example, for returns, code tagging, et cetera. So it's just another challenge, I guess.
Any other questions online or in the room?
We don't have any online, but I do just want to give a heads up to folks online. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand because it's a little hard when you come off mute. The background noise can be a little intense, but I don't want to mute you if you have a question. So just indicate to me in some way that you would like to participate.
Thanks, Kellen. And Jeff, I see your note to repeat the question when in person. We'll do that. I tried to put them in the chat where we didn't repeat them this time. Okay, next slide. So this was the bulk of the conversation in the small group, was about the Southwest. And the information, I'm not going to read it all to you, but the information on the left-hand side in that black box is just telling you that we had a very robust conversation about kind of, I would say, a phased approach to Rock Creek, that the decision wasn't about sort of shift everything out of Rock Creek to these other facilities or not. The conversation turned into a consideration of alternatives, like, could Rock Creek be an acclimation site? Could it be an interpretive center? Could it be entirely rebuilt? Of course, that's one option. Could it be partially rebuilt and just maintain the Springer program there? So the conversation was exploring all the options that might be available between a complete rebuild and a complete lack of investment at that facility. And one thing that emerged is that more information is needed to really evaluate the full suite of options that folks came up with at Rock Creek. So that is the sort of information that you have there on the left. I think the bullets on the right are some of the more specific considerations that group members raised. So there was high value for wild and hatchery spring Chinook. Lots of conversation around that. Concerns about hatchery fish straying, challenges related to broodstock collection and acclimation, particularly without Rock Creek. So there was a really robust conversation around the spring Chinook. There was a really robust conversation about the local economy there in the wake of the fire. There was a recognition that the community is still recovering from the fire and that there were important economic contributions from Rock Creek and from the spring Chinook fishery. And so, we sort of arrived at a place where there's a need for clear community engagement and partnership and communication with the local community about the alternatives that kind of emerged in this conversation that could be implemented at the Rock Creek facility. There was also a conversation about needing to talk to the local community about funding alternatives. There was a real recognition that, like any investment decision, if you spend your money at Rock Creek, like to do a full rebuild at Rock Creek, which as Sean described is very expensive, that means that you have limited investment opportunities elsewhere. And so the opportunity cost of investing at Rock Creek was a topic of robust conversation. And then there was some conversation around, and a lot of energy actually in the group around the investments and expansion opportunities that could be prioritized at Bandon and would have a high benefit for the Southwest system. So that's very high level, kind of I would call them the buckets of conversation that came up about the Southwest and about Rock Creek. I'm going to pause and see if anybody that participated in this small group has anything they want to add to this summary. Small group folks didn't get to see the summary before this, and they really are the authors of this conversation. We have one in the room, David Moskowitz.
Okay, is that loud enough? Clear enough?
Yeah.
Just thinking back to our discussion about the Southwest and Rock Creek, I think it's really important to be able to talk about the environmental conditions in the wild fish in the North Umpqua and that watershed. In thinking about the future, the North Umpqua has a lot of high quality habitat and water. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. That's what really drove our organization's approach in looking at you invest in Rock Creek. And it seems, for our point of view, it doesn't make sense, given the fact that it's a place where you already have probably the healthiest winter steelhead population. You have a strong spring Chinook, wild spring Chinook run. You have there's been a decision about summer steelhead that's going to benefit that wild population. The coho are doing okay there. You have robust trout and cutthroat. It's a system that's going to be resilient in the face of climate change. And so we think it's a real place to invest in wild fish. So that's why we are feeling very strongly about that would be a bad investment. And we think that it forecloses the ability to make investments elsewhere if you're going to rebuild at Rock Creek. Takes it off the map. And I think similarly, thinking about the Southwest, Elk River, you have, it's really the best habitat in that system. And so we're concerned about the expansion plans for that. But we realize there was that earlier slide that showed up on this, where you showed some of the arrows where production is moving, and your options shrink pretty quickly. But you've got to look at how the capacity of these watersheds to produce wild fish, and that's kind of our marker.
Thanks, David. I see a question, which I'll get to in a second. I wondered if there are any other perspectives from the small group that, you heard one perspective. There were 10 folks at the table, so there were other perspectives present as well. Okay, why don't we go to Is that you, Heath, coming on?
Yeah, I'll go real quickly. I mean, I think there was, at least on the recreational side, a recognition as well that that fishery in the North Umpqua, the spring Chinook fishery, is incredibly important, valuable economically, as well as, kind of from a societal standpoint there locally, and an interest in trying to figure out how to maintain that program. ODF and W talked about kind of how they've been getting by since 2020 and the fire impact on Rock Creek, and how they've been rearing at other locations and shifting release points. So I do think it's correct to say, when you're dealing with what we're forecasting as not an unlimited amount of money to invest into the hatchery system, that the cost of a full rebuild at Rock Creek could be prohibitive to doing things in other places that are needed. But there was also support for, again, maintaining that fishery there, the spring Chinook fishery, and some of the production. So, and I think there was also some questions about, are there ways to maybe do some of this in a more cost-effective way too? We didn't get into that or into the details, but I expect that will continue to happen as they look for an approach at Rock Creek that makes sense to maintain a fishery there, but lives within its means. So hopefully that added perspective helps a little bit.
Thanks, Heath. Kellen?
Yeah, we have a question from Ty. Was there any conversation in the small group concerning Willamette Coho Wild Run return at an all-time high? The point is, in real time, we are seeing the long-term benefits to wild fish that are often overlooked and has not been documented in Oregon's wild fish history.
Thanks, Ty. Somebody from the small group can correct me. I don't remember this specific topic coming up, but definitely the topic of the success of wild fish in certain fisheries did come up. I just don't remember this specific conversation. All right, can we go to the next slide? All right, we are at the phase where we have shared with you the factors that were developed by the small group, some of the high-level findings out of the small group's process of applying those factors to the alternatives that the department is considering and had their contractors consider. And now we'd really like to open up the conversation to include a broader swath of perspectives, so everybody's here today. And we're gonna do that in a couple different ways. And before we do that, we have one question I see. So let's go ahead and go to that question and then we'll move on. Kellen?
Thanks. Chris is asking, why weren't the Southwest alternatives framed as number one, rebuild Rock Creek, 2A, switch Rock Creek production to improve Bandon Hatchery, and 2B, improving production in both Bandon and Elk River?
The department's going to answer that question.
Well, I think in the alternatives we looked at, there really is no difference between them. They're all the same kind of outcome, because there's not that many ways you can look at a different way to operate the Southwest as a system. There's certainly different alternatives you can take at Rock Creek, but this wasn't looking at a single facility, it was looking at the system.
Thanks, Sean. For those of you following along on the agenda, there was a 10-minute break planned. We're a little bit behind, so I'm going to keep going, but I would invite folks to take a break as they need to. And we'll keep going. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So we wanted to offer opportunities for written feedback and oral feedback. So the survey is going to be the opportunity for written feedback. We're going to post the survey to the department's website tomorrow, I believe. and it's going to be open until November 26th. And that survey can be completed by anybody in this room or anybody that you share it with, anybody that goes to the department's website. And it will walk you through the process of sort of prioritizing the factors that we presented, telling us any other information you want to or thoughts you have about the factors and their application. And then there's also a space just to share other kind of feedback or comments that you have that you would like the department to consider. So that is your opportunity for written comment. And I would encourage you to share that broadly with the folks that you know who care about this issue, because it's going to be really valuable to see what people are thinking about the factors and how they prioritize them. And Kellen has dropped into the chat for folks online a link to the department's website. Hopefully everyone has that. That is where you can go for all of the data that we've talked about and information we've talked about, and then the survey tomorrow. Any questions about this survey? Liz has a question in the room. I'll repeat it because she doesn't have the mic.
Yeah, are you going to, you ask the, oh, sorry. You ask them what survey.
Liz was asking, does this survey include lead questions about level of engagement in the public process, so that the department has information about whether or not the person completing the survey has participated in this process? And then she suggested that if it's not included, it would be a good lead question. I think as drafted, it's not included, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's actually a pretty good idea. I'll take it on that.
Yeah, department is saying it sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. Yeah. Any other questions or comments, suggestions about the survey? Okay. Can we go forward a slide? So now is the time that we get to have a more open discussion and hear your thoughts and comments. We have this room until 4 o'clock if we need. I would remind you that there are 67 people online and I don't know, 20-ish of us in the room. So if everybody speaks for 1 hour, we'll be here for several months. No. So just sort of keep that in mind as you're sharing your perspectives. There are others here who will also want to share their perspectives. We're opening up the floor for comments, questions, perspectives on the alternatives, the process, the contractor reports, and other topics. I would say we are particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on the factors and the application of the factors. So we posed a few questions here. Are there other factors or considerations that you think we should include in the list? And then how would you prioritize the factors? What's most important to you, your organization, your constituents, as you look at the factors? As you think about the factors applied to specific facilities, I think it would be most helpful for the department to hear sort of, you know, when I think about Rock Creek, for example, this factor is very important to me and I don't think it's well understood. I think that kind of thinking is particularly helpful, more so than sort of general thinking like, I love Rock Creek, I fish there, please don't stop investing in Rock Creek. That's a little bit harder for the department to use in its considerations. That distinction makes sense? Okay. We will do our best to use the mic here in the room. Kellen, let us know if you can't hear. And then Kellen and I decided we would go back and forth between the room and the online room. So why don't we start in the online room with a couple of questions or comments if people have them?
We don't currently, oh, never mind. Roger is coming in with a comment. I only wish rather thinking about impacts to local jobs, but rather regional impacts. Roger, I don't know if you'd be willing to elaborate more on that. And if not, that's okay too. I am going to put the factors in the chat for folks, just to help ground the conversation and match it to what Teresa just said about relevance to the department too. Thank you, Roger.
The factors. Looks like you have one hand.
Yeah, go ahead, Colby, if you'd like to go off mute.
Yeah, hey, I just want to comment real quick on some of the factors that should be looked at, for these hatcheries. With budget shortfalls at hatcheries, let's just say in the past 10 to 15 years, short of staffing, deferred maintenance not being taken care of. I really think it should be a factor in consideration on the hatchery performance, and is this, can this affect hatchery performance, the PHOS factor, lack of deferred maintenance or employees doing what they're supposed to do or can do to draw fish. And just, I think, where the hatchery systems are at and how they are kind of broken could play a big part of why a big part of the factors on which we are at. So I think that should be noted. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come in the room. Does anybody have comments here in the room? I see a couple of hands. So we'll do 2 in the room and then we'll be back to you all online.
Again, I want to say that I represent the STEP program in Florence and also Oregon Coast Anglers. We oppose closure of Rock Creek. The Umpqua River.
Can I ask you to pull the mic closer to your mouth? Thanks.
The Umpqua River is second only to the Columbia River in size in the state of Oregon. And Rock Creek has been in existence for 120 years. We've talked about spring Chinook, fall Chinook, coho, summer, winter steelhead, rainbow trout. Those have all been coming out of Rock Creek for the years. At a minimum, we're requesting that you keep the current state of Rock Creek. I think they're doing a spring Chinook program there now, and maybe a fall Chinook. But if nothing else, it would be a great place to catch broodstock for the other fisheries if they do decide to move them to other fisheries. That's a broodstock catch area. And the other thing is that looking at the economic impact, I'm going to go back to it one more time. Guides are regulated by the Marine Board. ODFW needs to set up some administrative rules to get licensing of those guides and then look at having them log the number of angler trips, which you could have them do, and the success rate of those angler trips. That's how you can improve getting your economic benefit for future data.
Thank you. Can you all hear that decently online? Yep. Okay. We have one more in the room before we switch back to online.
Real quick, I want to first of all thank you for the comments on Leonard Krug. That put me way behind the 8 ball because we lost a great opponent. I mean, not opponent, a proponent. Learning to speak. I don't believe the volunteer hatchery program was not addressed as far as where it's going and how much. And coming from the 3 programs, or actually 4, on the Oregon coast, we put out a heck of a lot of fish, a lot cheaper. We've been roadblocked by ODF&W to not be able to really move forward. Like right now with Fall Chinook on the Umpqua. They got us at a terminal hatchery, will not allow us to move forward. So if they want something, we need support from people. Not a thing also was addressed about predators. Never has the department addressed sea lions, cormorants, and terns. They take a tremendous amount of our resources, but yet they do not address it one bit. In fact, they go the other way. We have to protect those poor little sea lions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go online for a couple comments.
Stephen, if you want to come off mute and say your question or comment.
Oh yeah, my comment is I know it wasn't really talked about that much, but there's been some things going around on the Clackamas system and for specifically the Eagle Creek hatchery. There's talk that it might close. Is there any interest in you guys taking that hatchery over? Whereas, not trying to take anything away from any other hatchery, but where money really doesn't have to be, there's already a running hatchery where you could just move into and start producing fish. I know that Eagle Creek is a huge part of the economics in that small town, all the way from not just Eagle Creek, but from, the Clackamas River, the Willamette River, everything that it provides for. I just want to know if you guys had any interest or had talked about maybe taking that hatchery over.
Yeah, thanks for the question. This has been coming up a lot lately. And I mentioned earlier that the Fish and Wildlife Service, which owns Eagle Creek and several other facilities in the Northwest, is having the same challenges that we're having with maintaining their system, both in terms of rising costs, flat funding, and then climate change impacting their ability to rear fish. At Eagle Creek specifically, it's a smaller facility. Like I think it's about a third of the production capacity is Clackamas, just up the road. And if you're talking about us taking that over, we don't currently have the money in our budget to operate all 14 facilities that we own. So taking over Eagle Creek would mean that we'd have to have another facility close in order to be able to pay for operation of that one, because it wouldn't come with any federal funds to operate it. The reason that Fish and Wildlife Service is struggling is because of flat funding in Mitchell Act and having to spread that across several facilities. So they're not actually proposing to close it at this point in time. They're struggling with funding the programs that are currently being run out of there. And then secondly, it has its own challenges related to water quality and quantity that would need to be addressed with some significant upgrades. And at this point in time, we're going to struggle to do what's needed to do in the 14 state facilities, let alone taking on another facility.
Thanks. And if we could add a comment from Ty. From a historical perspective, hatcheries have played a key role in wild fish conservation, including populations of wild fish that 100% naturalize and are not well documented by ODFW. Hatcheries are rarely acknowledged as tools to ensure the resilience of the future of wild fish, especially facing increasing threats from climate change and loss of habitat. And I have more folks with questions, but I want to go back to the room.
Thanks, Kellen. We'll come back to the online space in just a minute. Anybody in the room have comments, questions? All right, we'll go here and then here. Yeah. Oh, here. Oh.
Dennis Ritchie, first of all, I want to say that it's really difficult to blame a lot of this on ODFW. I was on the Sea Lion Task Force, the Federal Sea Lion Task Force. We've successfully really helped the situation at Bonneville and at Oregon City, and we're ongoing. We need to spread that, but it's federal pressure that's keeping us from being able to do it. It's not their fault. and they'd really love to be able to get in and do more. Also with the sea lions and, I mean, the terns, they successfully were able to get rid of one of the islands that was the nesting area in the Columbia, and that made a big difference there. And again, it's federal control that's keeping them from doing a lot of the stuff that we want done. So, you know, I don't love everything ODFW is doing, but at the same time, they need some credit where credit's due. As a former chair of the Oregon Hatchery Research Center, I think maybe we're looking at a problem that we can't control, and that's the weather. The water quality is really affecting our hatcheries, and maybe we need to look at the stocks that we're raising. And the Oregon Hatchery Research Center, I was vice chair and the chair for 3 years of the Oregon Hatchery Research Center when it first opened. They can do a lot of things, but right now their facility is out of line due to a slide. But the Salmon River might be a place where they could temporarily go in and control some things. I think that's a possibility. And the Salmon River also would be a possibility for a future step hatchery. That's it.
Thanks. Let's take one more in the room and then we'll switch back to online and come back. Oh, yep. Here we go.
Sorry, thank you, Ann. Just a little bit of a follow-up here. Yeah, thanks for the previous comment. Seth White, Oregon Hatchery Research Center. Really quick clarification. We're not offline. We're fully operational. We're at the Animal Aquatic Health Lab in Corvallis. But then I also just wanted to thank all the small group members that did this work. And I noticed reading the notes that there were a couple of highlights of research needs and research monitoring needs. And I just hope that at some point in the process, those could be documented, because we at OHRC, we do research. We have a small but not insignificant research fund, and we're just about to put out the request for proposals for that. So there might be things like, for example, linking the data with the considerations to come up with those factors that maybe we could help with. So I hope my comment is short enough that maybe we can get Ann in as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And also thank you for the reminder. If you don't mind stating your name before you speak, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. Hello, my name is Ann Velisis. I'm speaking today as president of the Kalmiopsis Audubon Society. We have over 400 members down in Curry County who are concerned about the future of habitat for birds, fish, and wildlife. We've got anglers for members, for many members, and we do a lot of river conservation, river habitat conservation. And we've engaged with ODFW and fish management as stakeholders and the CMP, as well as in efforts to conserve. We've done efforts to conserve habitat and to monitor for salmon in Elk River. So that's why I'm here today. I heard some of you gentlemen talking about how much volunteer time that has been spent, and I just want to say that I've put in thousands of hours of volunteer time working on the green infrastructure that produces fish, which is habitat, trying to conserve it, and really care about that in our region. So I'm here today to voice our concern about the plan to expand operations at our Elk River Hatchery. The hatchery now raises about 500,000 fish, and the proposal is to expand it to raise about another 200,000 fish from other rivers. Elk River Hatcheries always kind of raise fish from Elk River, traditionally from Elk River and the Chetco, two really pristine special rivers on our coast. So the proposal is to start bringing them in from other places. And I get the sense in this process that, you know, ODFW is regarding Elk River as kind of another black square in a checkerboard where we just move fish around to balance the budget. And I think in this big picture view, we're missing some really important things, an important and crucial perspective about how incredibly special this little watershed is and its intrinsic potential to actually produce salmon if we don't screw it up. So I just have to say a little bit more, and I hope you guys don't mind, because I haven't been able to be part of any other process because, of course, groups like those that aren't in the group process can't say. So this is kind of like the one time I get to talk about how important Elk River is. If you were to fly over the Coast Range in Southern Oregon, Elk River would stand out as a little oasis of green in a sea of clear cuts. And a key reason for this is because it's a place where people from the local community have spent decades of work trying to advocate to protect for habitat for salmon and steelhead in that water. It's one of the few watersheds of its size on the Coast Range that still has old growth forest. And as both OSU and UW researchers have said, it's still a place that has dynamic processes that make for good habitat. Big logs falling into the river, stuff like that, that's still happening in Elk River. 70% of the watershed's public lands, including wilderness that protects the most productive spawning habitat in the basin, and wild and scenic designations that protect other spawning tributaries. And the elk is legendary for brilliant green water that clears quickly late in the season in November and December, which is why anglers love to come and fish the Elk River. Lots of friends that I know love to fish it, and I love to eat salmon from it. And simply put, many people just love this river. It's a gem. It's one of the last great places. This is also a place where millions of dollars have been invested in fish habitat restoration. On the lower river ranches, we've restored riparian habitat, and there's projects in progress to restore off-channel habitat. We've got projects in progress to remove the final fish barriers in this basin and to clean up a former mill site to restore off-channel habitat. We have land acquisition and conservation easements, all oriented towards habitat restoration too. So anyway, for the factors, it's these environmental conditions and the possibility to produce wild fish that we have in this basin that are super important. I want to say Elk River Hatchery currently benefits from many of these conservation efforts that so many of people have put forward. And so in return, it has to be a good neighbor to wild fish, as Sean often uses that expression. But I'm concerned that expanding operations will make that harder. Just to tell you a little bit more about it, this is already a pretty big hatchery program on a very small river. As many of you know, our South Coast rivers flow very low in late summer, and the returning salmon are adapted to this, but with climate change, the margins may be growing narrower. Already, the Elk River Hatchery uses about 20 to 24 CFS of the river's flow. And in late summer, the river's flow has been dropping down to like 38 or 37 CFS. So in other words, more than half of the whole river flows through the hatchery and back into the stream. But the river downstream from the hatchery is already considered to be impaired for temperature. So adding any thermal load by having like more raceways and more asphalt and all that stuff is going to be highly concerning to me, because we also have juvenile fall Chinook that are in the river at that time. And they need good habitat for rearing. Our fall Chinook fell below critical status last year for the first time in many, it had done it once before, but anyway. So I think this is a place where we need to keep our eyes on the prize of protecting what we have. And so for that reason, I encourage ODFW to focus its hatchery expansion investments on bigger rivers that need the fish enhancement and that have the capacity to accommodate those increases in like effluent and waste or temperature, such as at the Bandon Hatchery on the Coquille River or at Coal Rivers, where I think there's just more capacity to accommodate, I think. In Bandon, it's already also located lower in the river system, and it's closer to other rivers that are in need of enhancement. Let's see. Yeah, Elk River from its start is focused on raising local fish, and I'd hate to see this thing where we're going to start moving fish from all sorts of different places, different rivers to this river, and with the risks that brings. The proposal adds risks to our local fish and our special local place without adding any benefit to our local fishery. So anyway, I just want to say finally, I'm really troubled by this process, which kind of was sort of a small group process that excluded other people. And the process suggests that we're still making a decision about what's happening, but on Elk River, there's actually projects already out to bid to do this. And we found that out kind of halfway through this project, and there hasn't been any engagement to the local community. So, so anyway, all of that, that's just what I want to say. There's a lot more, but I just want to say this is such a special place, and I hope that when you guys think about this, you'll take some of that into consideration about why this is a place where we should be able to have wild fish. And native fish producing. I know that word is troubling to some people, but I guess what I mean by wild fish is fish that come back to the river and just spawn and breed on their own and keep coming back. And we got some of that. We got a good, so I'd like it to see it keep going. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to the online space, and Kel, I see you have a plan. Go for it.
Thank you. If we can fit in 2 folks in a comment, that would be appreciated. Let's start with Yancey, and then we'll go to Gina's comment. And Stephen, I'm not sure if your hand is up from the previous call or if you have another question, but we'll start with Yancey.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I guess I'm going to contrast a little bit with the previous comment. I want to compliment ODFW on the process so far. I think this is either the 3rd or 4th online meeting that you've had, and I've participated in all of them, and I've read all the materials on the website, and I think you've done a fantastic job of getting the word out there and gathering input. And I know you're still, have a long ways to go, but I want to commend the department on what I think has been a very open and transparent process, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate. I do have a factor comment, and it's kind of hatchery cost, I guess. It's more economic. So there's only been a very gross discussion of budget and costs. This number of $220 million was thrown out as the total need, and then some savings from the various alternatives. But it's a pretty broad brush statements, and without any kind of timeline. You've shown these slides where there's been these arrows where things get moved around, and that's great. But there's no timing associated with that. Is this stuff that would all happen, next biennium? Is it something that would happen over 10 years? I think part of the decision process has got to be, what can be done when, at what cost, and what cost savings. And without that, I think I personally struggle with thinking about what I would think would be the appropriate path forward. And so just obviously there's a lot still to be thought through here, and a lot of planning to be done, and a budget has to be approved and all that kind of stuff. But as you go forward, if there could be some more detail into exactly what these alternatives would entail, in what timeline, that I think would be really helpful.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, this really is taking quite a long look ahead over the next 20, 30 odd years, and thinking about what, at the end of that period, what the system might look like. And you're right, like a lot of those arrows are going to need to be sequenced. So for example, this coming year where we have our $20 million capital bonding request into the legislature, if that's approved, we'll direct that towards the higher priority projects in that kind of roadmap. And that's where we've collected all this information, and you're all providing us with your feedback, but also where the factors are really important to us, because those are things that are durable through time. And then we can take those, and whenever we have decisions to make, like we have, say next year, we have a $20 million bond, we can apply those factors and say, well, where are we going to spend that? And obviously in the Northwest, if you were going to go with a different model, to make that work, you would need to do some expansions at Cedar Creek and Fall River and Oak Springs before you could move those fish out of the existing facilities. So whether you can afford to do all that in one request, or it's going to take 2 or 3 biennia, those are the details we have to work through. And then whether we, for example, invest in the Southwest system before the Northwest system, that's where the factors are really important for us, because that gives us a framework to make decisions along the way, rather than saying right now, because we don't know what funding we're going to have through time. But as that funding becomes available and as certain decisions need to be made, we can apply that same framework and say what makes sense. So it's going to be a very long process with a lot of different decision points, where there's also opportunity for you all to weigh in, either with the commission or legislature and with us. But this is outlining a general approach to how we're going to prioritize investments and where.
Thanks, Sean. I'd love to read Gina's comment, and then if we can fit one more raised hand before going back to the room. Gina's comment is, one thing I think is not as well understood is the importance of the STEP program providing salmon in the classroom from hatcheries. I used to be an educator, and my husband is a 4th grade teacher that raises trout in the classroom each year out of Troutdale. I've assisted with their release each year, and I can't emphasize enough how beneficial it is for the kids to learn about fish so that they care about the resource and get interested in science. Families come too, and it really makes it a community event. Oregon in general is well known for us raising fish in the classroom, and I think it's a priceless part of our state culture. And if we don't engage kids and community members in the resource through programs like this, they won't be invested in protecting it for the future. Thanks, Gina. We definitely heard that in both previous large public meetings and the small group meetings as well. Andrew, I would love to go to you next if you want to unmute.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment. My name is Andrew Cioni. I live and work in Southwest Oregon. I am an angler who fishes primarily for food. I actually just ate smoked fish for lunch. And I also monitor salmon in the Elk River for Kelmiopsis Audubon Society. Primarily, I am concerned about increased hatchery production at Elk River. Elk River is the most pristine watershed on the south coast. Even after the Anvil fire, it continues to have high quality habitat. And the Elk River watershed is my favorite place in the world. However, Elk River Fall Chinook are recognized by ODFW as a non-viable population. This is concerning because of the high quality of the habitat. I recommend that ODFW not increase production at the Elk River hatchery and to not place more strain on the watershed and Fall Chinook population. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, we're going to come back in the room for a couple of comments, and then we'll go back online. I see 2 hands here.
Hello, my name is Bruce Harple, and I'm 2 of the factors up there, the hatchery performance and hatchery cost. I do have a question is because I understand that it's possible to operate hatcheries with other goals than raising them to the smolt stage, where a person can actually raise fry, put fry in the rivers, put small par in the river, actually use hatch box type facility right in the river, which is being done. And then on top of that, eyed out eggs can be planted directly into waterways. And this would reduce a lot of the holding cost at hatcheries. And perhaps Rock Creek would be a primary spot to try some of these different things in conjunction with the Oregon Hatchery Research Center involvement in that. Is this something that would or could be thought to save some money for the programs?
It's that kind of program shift from more of a smolt-based harvest augmentation program to a pre-smolt or a swim fry or egg planting is not really under consideration in this process, where we're really looking at maintaining an infrastructure that can deliver a certain kind of number of fish for whatever uses there are at the time. And there are certainly trade-offs with those different approaches. The one you identified being that the longer you keep a fish in a facility, the more costly it is, and the more risk there is involved with the facility itself. But on the flip side, we've transitioned largely away from hatch boxes and egg out plantings, because they weren't really addressing the bottleneck in survival for these fisheries, which is used to be overwinter rearing, and now it's becoming summer rearing as well. And so no matter, if you look at the monitoring in some of these basins, you see a plateau where no matter how many fish you have spawning in those areas, you only get a certain number of smolts migrating out because there's a bottleneck. And the reason we kind of transitioned to more smolt-based programs for harvest is because we got better returns, better survival, and so more fish back. So you're balancing that increased cost versus the increased return to anglers in most cases. And then particularly as we transition to mark selective fisheries, because of wild fish status, those fish aren't being marked, and so they're not available in those mark selective fisheries. So there's pros and cons to it.
Thanks, Sean. We have another in-room comment.
Bill Hennig from Florence Step Group. Mike, at the overview today, we saw a green arrow pointing over to tribal. I wonder what kind of contribution the tribes are doing financially or otherwise.
So we're still in the middle of that discussions with those tribes, the 9 tribes in Oregon, and we're not at the point of specifics like that in terms of the system going forward. I think if you look at engagement as it is today, there's certainly some tribes that are engaged at helping ODFW operate hatcheries or operating their own facilities, like in Northeast Oregon. So it's kind of a variable approach across the landscape, and that is through this process we're talking with them, asking the same questions we're asking all of you, like how do we think about investing in this system to deliver what the tribes need as well? And at some point here, we're going to merge everything we've heard into developing this roadmap.
Thanks, Sean. Kellen, I think we're up to the online room.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Come off mute and ask your question or comment.
Am I off mute?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay. My name is Chris Viverberg. I moved to the Elk River after a career in fluvial geomorphology and river habitat restoration because I found that there are few rivers left like this one anywhere. And we're one of those hybrid families where I'm in it for the larger ecosystem, but I live with an avid fly fisherman. It is truly one of a kind special river. And when I think about the proposal to expand the hatchery operations, I worry about the risks to this extraordinary river. And when I talk to my neighbors about this proposal, they share my concerns. My concerns specifically are about adding 200,000 fish, their waste to the river, and the increased risk of pathogens and disease to our local fish, since the new fish that will be raised will be coming from other rivers. I am upset that ODF&W has never done any outreach locally about this proposal, and it's a project that informs us that there's possibly a doubling of water use to support the rearing ponds, but you can't find any of that information anywhere on the ODFW site other than a brief mention of new rearing ponds in one of the technical documents. And the details on what is being proposed, I had to dig up by going to other sites to find bid documents, which are out for public review now, and incidentally the bids are due for this project the same day that our survey is due back to ODF&W. I suppose my overarching point here is that I think the cart is before the horse from a local perspective, and I would like to request that ODFW pause its implementation of the Elk River hatchery expansion until the proposed operational changes can be presented and evaluated in a local forum by community stakeholders. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to read a question from Dana. Have you looked at drawing water from the main stem to operate Rock Creek? Rock Creek is 1/2 mile from the Umpqua.
Thanks for that question. So Rock Creek does have a couple of water rights, one off Rock Creek itself and one off the North Fork Umpqua. And historically, we have drawn water from the North Fork Umpqua during the summer months when Rock Creek is too hot. So certainly have been taking advantage of that over time. It comes with its own costs of obviously pumping water. And then going forward, to the extent we need to do that versus investing in chilling and research would depend on the species and volume of fish that are on site. So those are some of the things we've been discussing. Is if you're going to have limited production on site, would you need chilling and recirculation, or could you be successful using the cooler water in the North Umpqua? And how often could you be successful? Because we've had troubles in the past with survival and performance of those programs, even using North Umpqua water, and we expect those challenges will continue and probably exacerbate in the future, but there's likely still some opportunity there to be successful in some scenarios. So appreciate the question. It's something we're certainly considering.
And then I'll just go ahead and finish off with a comment from Ty. Might be noted that the Elk River Hatchery was the site of the original Oregon Hatchery Research Facility. All steelhead production currently is out of basin plants, with no Elk River steelhead being released at the facility. And I'll send it back to the room.
Thanks, Kellen. Comments in the room? I have one here. There it is.
Thank you very much. Mark Sherwood, Native Fish Society. Gosh, I just want to thank everybody for this opportunity to provide, comment, and wow, what a process you all have been through so far. Native Fish Society is a nonprofit organization. We are advocates for wild native fish. We envision a future with abundant wild native fish and healthy, free-flowing rivers. And I think that's where, there's this intersection with a huge opportunity, which is that the Oregon coast is so largely free-flowing. It isn't there are so few stretches as significant as the Oregon coast that have so many rivers without major impoundments. Native Fish Society is involved in a number of dam removal projects, beer removal projects, and everybody dreams of free-flowing rivers. And here we have on our coast this tremendous opportunity. I've got kind of a scattershot of comments here, so bear with me. In terms of factors, probably comes as no surprise that we recommend wild fish be strongly considered among those factors. And I think, two things come out of that. There's both a biological reason to do so and a legal and policy reason to do so. From a biological perspective, these fish are adapted to their local watersheds. They go through their whole life cycle naturally, and in doing so, they become attuned to their particular streams and watersheds. They're going to be able to adapt well to climate change if we invest in their watersheds, if we keep water in stream. From a legal perspective, we've seen over the last few years when wild fish populations have declined and they cross these thresholds, when they go into conservation status or critical status or Endangered Species Act listings, all fisheries are curtailed. It impacts wild fish fisheries and hatchery fish fisheries. And so if we can protect those needs of our wild fish and ensure that they're healthy and abundant, it enables the opportunity for some of these other basins where you have hatchery-based fisheries as well. Among the considerations for wild fish, one of the factors that I haven't really seen, maybe not articulated as deeply in the wild fish factor, maybe it's already there. So forgive me if I'm just stating what already exists. But wild fish are contributing a ton to harvest on the coast. Specifically, if we're thinking about like false Chinook, and that's a rare situation. I believe the 2014 Coastal Management Plan stated that 80% of the fall Chinook harvested on the coast were wild. So I want to make sure that we're thinking about those trade-offs, the economic trade-offs of what if we invested, what more investments could we make in nature to expand that 80%, or to make that 80% of our harvest of some of these fisheries more resilient and more available long term. I think that this process is a great start to looking at, the hatchery contribution. I think we really need an equal analysis of the wild fish contributions. And I also think we need to consider what are the costs to wild fish populations when we've had hatchery programs that exist in the same watersheds as wild fish. I think there's significant cost that's going to be incurred by enabling hatchery fish to be good neighbors, which I appreciate hearing that sentiment. But I think given that there aren't major barriers that can be used to separate hatchery and wild fish, the cost of enabling those hatchery programs that continue to be good neighbors, I think, needs to be factored in as well. And so I guess just zooming out, I think there's a need before we proceed with this blueprint to really step back and consider the entire path ahead. And Native Fish Society, I think perhaps in the past folks have viewed that we don't have an interest in harvest. I met with Leonard Krug a lot during the Rogue South Coast plan process, and with a lot of tribal partners and folks in the interim, over the last decade or more, and it really impressed me the importance of harvest and the opportunity for that. And I think on the coast we have with our wild fish, with our Chinook, we have an opportunity to do something sustainable that maybe there isn't that opportunity right now in Puget Sound or the Columbia Basin. So I encourage us to really think boldly about what those alternative possibilities could be. A couple of quick comments on basins, and I think one of the challenges that I heard that kind of came out of this whole process is it was supposed to be focused on facilities. It's almost impossible to just talk about facilities without talking about programs. And if you can't talk about, and then you also need to be talking about wild fish. So it feels like there needs to be this bigger conversation, and it sounds like this is going to feed into that hopefully in the future. But I think just some basins in particular, basins on the coast that have high percentages of federally managed protected lands, like the Nestucca, like the Nehalem, like the North Umpqua, like Elk River. I mean, these places have absolutely invaluable habitat. And I think we owe it to future Oregonians, current Oregonians, to really lean into the work and efforts of past conservationists to allow those habitats to continue to produce fish naturally. Sorry, I know I've gone for quite a minute here. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some comment into this process. And so, yeah, I guess in closing, we look forward to how this process will begin to intersect with some of these other considerations as it relates to wild fish and the real need to prioritize the needs of wild fish for the benefit of our environment and Oregonians, and the many values that folks bring to our fisheries. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments in the room? One in the back. Here we go. And then we'll come to the online group after this comment.
Again, my name is Conrad Gowell with Wild Fish Conservancy. I wanted to start off with a quick fish story. I was out with my 2.5-year-old fishing on the coast, and we harvested our first wild Chinook together, about a 25-pound female on the coast just this last weekend. And I also reminded me of the stories my elders told me of how coho almost disappeared from the Oregon coast in the 1980s. It was rare to see one, and to see the fisheries come back like they have this year on wild fish is truly inspiring. I guess that leads me to my disappointment with this process, which is the zero-sum gain thinking, and which is kind of imbued the whole process. I think hatcheries were meant to try to mitigate for the loss of fish in many circumstances. And when some populations are at 3% of their historical abundance, and we're just trying to maintain status quo, we're losing a lot for what we can rebuild for future generations. The Willamette Coho was brought up earlier. Those hatchery programs in the Willamette were run for a lot of years, and they didn't do very well. Their performance indicators were rock bottom, and those programs were stopped. And fast forward 30 years, as those fish have been allowed to adapt to those watersheds, you have a wild run that's coming back in higher numbers than the entire Oregon coast at its low point in the 1990s. And I think there's lessons to be learned here, is if we prioritize wild fish, we can get them back in big numbers. And we don't have to rely on mark selective fisheries to chart a path for future Oregonians. And so I understand the politics around wanting to just maintain production, but I would encourage us to think outside of the box and envision a future in which we don't have to rely on hatcheries as much to meet our harvest needs. Because I think the environment has such a larger capacity to provide for future generations than the mechanical systems of a hatchery, especially with the changing climate that we're encountering. And not only for our children, but also the other species that also depend on wild fish. People talk about sea lions and terns, but there's also blue herons and dippers and orca whales. And it is the whole system that relies on these fish. And when you remove fish out of the river and put them in a hatchery, you also disconnect that relationship. So yeah, I guess I want to make sure that we're not crippling ourselves to think beyond what's currently existing, and to envision a system that continually builds wild fish to an abundance we know is possible based on the historical record. So, thank you.
Thank you. Online?
Jack, if you want to go ahead and come off mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things. One, it was just entered into the conversation that the coastal rivers are unencumbered and unblocked. The fact is, in the North Coast where I live, the Nestucca, the Wilson, the Trask, they all have reservoirs on the upper end of them that suck water out of the rivers to send it to the metro area for drinking water. So there is no such thing as they're unencumbered. And then also, I know a lot of the people that fish, they fish for all the beautiful reasons we all fish, but they also fish for food, for something to take home, a retention fishery. And as an example, it was kind of entered into the conversation that the Rock Creek hatchery wasn't needed because we have high value habitat and all these runs are in great shape. Having said that, you can't retain a wild fish anywhere on that river. And at one time it was legal because, I mean, there's, like, as an example, winter steelhead, there's literally tons of them. But now you can catch 15 or 20 a day and you're not allowed to keep any. So I guess I just want to put that in the conversation. That's all.
Thanks, Jack. That's all we have right now for the online space, Teresa.
Thanks, Kellen. Anything in the room? There's a hand up. Hold on one sec. Let's get to the mic.
And billions have been spent on all these programs. Let's go back to basics and get fish in the river.
Thanks. Anybody else? One hand up.
Maybe a question for the department, but whoever wants to answer, as just moving forward in these changes, going down the different alternatives and whichever ones get selected, is this going to be done in like an adaptive management kind of context where there's a plan for monitoring the results and monitoring the outcomes and potentially being open to changes as you move forward? And maybe something doesn't work out exactly as you thought it would in 10 years and there's some kind of capacity to make a change and be flexible.
Yeah, certainly, Seth, in a couple of ways. So what we're really outlining here or working on is this roadmap for the infrastructure, understanding that we have the programs in place that we have today, and they're kind of governed through a lot of these plans and policies that are in place, which have that adaptive management component. Like they have thresholds, targets, metrics that we're tracking. And at each kind of review point, you may change the way you're operating those programs. So that kind of framework will continue in terms of the programs themselves and adaptive management. The infrastructure, for sure, we've made our best projections at what the future might hold in these locations, but things may progress more quickly or less quickly than we anticipate. And we may have changes in the basin like fire that come through and totally change the picture. And so when we get to each of these decision points where we have funding or have to make investment decisions in the system, we'll be looking at these factors and applying them kind of in real time. We're looking to set a roadmap at the beginning, but we'll adjust based on what we're delivered at the time in terms of funding and the environment.
Thanks. Kellen, I think you have one person online. Bill?
Kellen, no, this is Bill Monroe Jr. Am I coming through here pretty good this time?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. It's technology is working. Well, thanks so much on this part of this. Going through all these steps is not only informative, but it is actually shedding some light for a lot of members of the public and all the things. It's very, very, very helpful. Jack Smith just hit it right on the head. Things have coming into the conversation that are showing light of the true issues that we do have at hand. And that is, the user groups we're going to sit here and we're going to bicker with each other over what we think is the most important thing to be able to move forward, to come down to how the state is going to be able to, quote unquote, manage fisheries. And as far as what we are doing as recreational enthusiasts and outdoor people and the whole big picture, wild fish matter. And that is a big thing. But hatchery fish and the production thereof and the need to actually, it's a little bit more important, the need to save killer whales and provide economic, all the things, the bigger pictures that we're so far past as a society to try and rewild anything that we absolutely need. Hatchery fish. The tribes know it. We know it. It's an actual thing, and we can't be going back and forth. And I don't think that's what this meeting is, by the way, to be able to go back and forth about what we think is the most important thing and who's going to do this and that. That's not what we should be doing. But you guys and showing all of this hatchery resilience issues and the funding and the way that we're going to be able to find a way forward and actually to be able to rewrite HGMPs to the point where we can't be continually sued is very important. And I just wanted to say thank you guys for allowing that point to get across.
Thanks, Bill. That's all we have virtually right now. Teresa?
All right. Anybody in the room? We have one comment in the room.
Yeah. Hey, folks. This is Jennifer Fairbrother with Native Fish Society. So I was one of the folks that participated in the small group. And one of the things I think came up a number of times that we wrestled with that I think would be helpful as you all are thinking about the comments you want to make in the survey and maybe providing some information back to the department is what uncertainty do we have? How do you kind of assess the different levels of uncertainty on things, and how do you think it's best that or how do you think the department could manage that uncertainty or include that uncertainty management idea in their decision-making processes? So, for instance, like what degree of uncertainty do we have about the environmental conditions, and how should the department think about that as it's making decisions? So I think that could be potentially useful input to provide, because it is certainly something that I think we as a small group wrestled with as well. Uncertainty about funding, things like that. So just kind of offering that as something for people to provide input on.
Thanks, Jennifer. David has a comment.
Hi, thanks. David Moskowitz with Conservation Angler. And I just want to say thanks to the department staff, Chris and Sean, and to Kellen and Teresa for managing this. I was in the small group. We were not an easy group necessarily to sort of manage, but it was an important effort. And for Liz and Sean and some of the others who were there at the table for those meetings, I thought there was some really good discussion. And I think what I want to say is we need to keep in mind that we're trying to come up with a roadmap to the future. This isn't just the next legislative session, but it's really onward. We're doing this in a long-term way, and we've got to think about not just those of us who love fish, and we've heard from people in the room who've actually been fishing within 24 hours and have eaten fish from Oregon, it probably as early as lunchtime. That's really important. But we've got to think about the future generations, the generations yet unborn, who we want to experience the Oregon wild fish and wild rivers environment. And so we're trying to do this. And I think that's where I've just been encouraged with the department, the way Sean has described the department's view of this being a 20-year or maybe even longer roadmap. And I think we're just starting on that trail. So all of us who are in this room, we need to buckle up and get on that Oregon Trail to the future, because there's a lot more work to do ahead of us. But I just want to say thank you, all the staff.
Thanks, David. Anybody online come up with questions? Okay. Yeah. One question in the room.
This is Anne. I'd like to ask a question following up on David's, which is, talking about this as a 20-year plan or a long plan. Could you help us understand a little bit more like where the process moves forward now? Are you guys going to develop a 20-year blueprint? Is there going to be more like public comment, or because it sort of sounds like you're also developing a budget plan like in a real short term, and then there's this long-term project. So I'm a little bit unclear as to how all of this fits together. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. I think you're not alone in wondering that. And that's part of the challenge here, is that there's so many different decision points down the line that are going to occur in different fora. So there's the work the department does and the decisions we make internally. There's the work that the commission does on policies and planning. And there's the work that the legislature does on policies and funding. And just as an example, in session next year, there's the agency request budget, which has capital bonding requests in it. It also has, as part of the agency's recommended budget proposal, to close 2 facilities because we don't have enough funding for our annual operating expenses. So those are 2 fora in the legislature where elements of this roadmap will be discussed and debated. And depending on what comes out of that, we'll be looking to prioritize where any investments that we secure are made using this roadmap. And then in future, like the CMP revision or the RSC revision or any future plan that replaces those plans, that's where we'll have to kind of debate, discussion about the actions that are associated with those plans and hatchery wild programs and investments. So there's just going to be so many different decision points in these different fora, and this is really just setting out a roadmap for, based on what we know today, where we think those investments might be made to give that flexibility in the future to respond to whatever that need of the day might be. And then the factors will be really important to us because the factors are durable through time, but the information associated with those factors will change through time. And so you can take that same framework and inform your decisions at each of those points. Does that help?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, thank you.
I see a couple questions online. I don't know who is first.
Yeah, let's start with Stephen Mills and then we'll go to Larry.
Yeah, my name is Stephen Mills, and this is just kind of a question, I guess, towards the department. And that is, do we know what the annual revenue is that comes from sport fishermen? And also, it was mentioned in the conversation that we're seeing these, really, really great runs of wild fish on the coast, Chinook and coho. And is there any studies that show that getting rid of hatcheries or hatchery fish was a reason that those fish were coming back so abundantly?
So to your first question, I hesitate to say this because I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I think it's something on the order of 50 odd million in fish license revenue generated biennially, so every 2 years, so about half of that annually. And then I think an earlier question asked, like, how is that going to divide it up? And it's really divided up into a few chunks, one being hatcheries, one being the management side of things, one being monitoring, and one being enforcement. And then also there's just the administrative cost of doing business in the state of Oregon with Department of Administrative Services and internally. So it gets chunked up into each of those buckets internally. In terms of the wild Chinook and coho fisheries, when you look through time, there really hasn't been a change in total production of Chinook on the coast. There's certainly been a shift from unfed fry, pre-smolt towards more smolt-based release, but that has been pretty static through time over the last 30 odd years. The coho is the one where we saw some big reductions in hatchery programs following the 90s. And there was really a suite of actions that were taken that's responsible for the recovery of coho. So there was the change in hatchery practices, where historically we had about 90% proportion of hatchery fish on the spawning grounds. It was impacting the productivity of those wild populations. That got reduced. In the early 2000s, we had pretty significant harvest of wild fish in the ocean that got eliminated through the planning efforts. And then there was a lot of work on habitat on the Oregon coast. There's been a lot of work by partners, including a lot of folks in this room, on removing barriers, doing habitat restoration. That's really helped a lot. And then there was the kind of freshwater fishery management side of things too. So it's really that suite of actions that's responsible for the recovery. Teasing out any one of those when you changed everything all at once is really hard to do. But certainly when you look at why they were listed, it highlighted the limiting factors at the time, and those were the things that were addressed through the recovery actions.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Sean. Larry, mic is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Just echoing what others have said, I really appreciate the agencies, providing this transparent, inclusive opportunity for us to have this discussion and, discuss how we collectively move forward with, with all the pieces of this that are complicated. I don't know who said it earlier, but we traded the ability for our natural systems to produce salmon for a variety of other uses. And the outcome of that process is agriculture and timber harvest and population and all transportation and all the pieces of the puzzle that society needs. But at the end of the day, if currently the agency faces a significant challenge moving forward, and that is collectively we have to advocate for additional resources so the agency can answer some of these difficult questions that we've been asking today, and they're complicated and they are necessary. I would love if we could look at pure science that told us if we just did away with hatcheries, we'd have abundant fish. And while that might be the case in some areas, we're likely to need additional hatchery production to maintain opportunity for harvest and conservation programs in the future. So, long-winded way of saying, I'm hoping that everyone in this room and online will advocate for the resources Oregon needs moving forward to meet the needs of the fish and meet the needs of the people of the state of Oregon. But once again, thanks Sean and the team for listening to us, and certainly lots of different perspectives in the room, but I appreciate everyone's professionalism, and at the end of the day, I think we all walked away learning something. So thank you.
Thanks, Larry. If I could add one more comment from Chris from online. A question. Moving forward, can we have a presentation to the local communities of the elk and banded hatcheries before the state contracts for major infrastructure expansions in our watersheds?
Chris, I think it was. Yeah, I'm not going to commit to that today, but I will talk to staff internally about that.
Any comments in the room, online? Okay, 2 final comments in the room.
Thanks. Mark Sherwood, Native Fish Society. I just wanted to make sure that Native Fish Society is on the record in sharing the concerns regarding the bid that's out to expand the Elk River Hatchery. I do agree. We agree that it's the cart before the horse, and we would love to see more community engagement and a greater consideration of how Elk River fits into the larger, hatchery and wild future plans. Along those lines too, we would love to see some consideration from the department for, an equal investment in wild fish, in monitoring, enforcement, watershed investments moving forward as well. Thanks.
Thanks. We have one more final comment. We're going to have a lot of final comments, maybe.
Something a little different, and I'm curious about the chum salmon fishery on the Nestucca River. For many, many years, I fished that river and there were no chum, virtually. They seem to be coming back pretty well now. And last year, I wasn't aware of it. I caught a very nice one. I killed it, took it home, found out later if I had been checked, I could have been fined for doing that. Why on earth don't you allow someone to take a chum salmon? In fact, most people wouldn't. The word is out that they don't eat good. But if you know what you're doing, they do eat really good. But I'm just curious, why would I have been fined for killing a chum salmon? They seem to be coming back totally on their own. Nobody seems to care. It's just kind of one of those oddities.
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one. So our coastal chum salmon populations, this was a topic that was covered in the development of the Coastal Multi-Species Plan, and we did an analysis of those populations at that time, and we found a couple of things. One of them is that those populations are probably very far below their historical abundance, and so they're very depressed relative to their historical abundance, and some of them are just kind of barely have a pulse. And so there are healthy populations that are sustaining in a few watersheds in the North Coast, and a population of the equina that, again, that seems to be fairly strong and self-sustaining, but we don't feel like those populations are in a place right now where directed harvest is a good idea, and we're still trying to figure out and doing research on kind of what the population structure and status of those fish are. And so down the road, if we can restore those populations and have more productive populations throughout, I think the opportunity to harvest those fish would be great. But right now, I just don't think they're in a place where we would feel comfortable having directed harvest on those populations. And people do take advantage of the catch and release opportunities in the Tillamook, and people really enjoy that fishery. But yeah, I think we're some distance away from having a directed fishery for chum.
All right. Any other comments online or in the room? Or can we move to next steps? We're having in the room a recipe conversation, and I am hopeful that folks will share because salmon is our Thanksgiving meal. So I'm accepting recipes. Any other comments? One in the back, and then we'll move to next steps.
Again, this is Conrad Gowell, Wild Fish Conservancy. I just wanted to, I remembered there was one other factor I wanted to discuss, and it's related to, I think there was a opportunity cost under the wild fish factor. And I just wanted to make sure people knew about the study up in British Columbia on the Chilliwack, which looked at the cost of producing a hatchery smolt in the river versus producing a wild smolt via habitat restoration. And what they found, to summarize, is that those things were almost identical cost-wise for a single year. But that carry forward effect of doing the habitat restoration, those hatchery smolts were produced every year thereafter, whereas in the hatchery you had to do it continually, year after year. And as inflation took place and costs increased, those hatchery fish got more expensive. So while we're trying to balance a 20+ year plan, I think those are important factors to look at with the opportunity costs and thinking about what wild runs are really being hampered by not enough resources being focused on habitat restoration. And if you are going to be closing facilities, how you can leverage investments in those local watersheds to maybe even get more benefit for fisheries and even harvest in certain circumstances for those populations. So I really see that as a win-win opportunity. And I hope that's not going to be outside the scope of the conversation moving forward in the budgeting process.
Well, there we go. Thank you. And it looks like that brought up a couple comments online, or maybe they're independent.
We have a hand raised. Mark Hutchinson, if you'd like to come off mute and say a few words.
Sure. First of all, I thank you for putting all the time into this and the investment and listening to everybody. I think that's really important. I'm with Northwest Steelheaders, but I've been involved in environmental issues for, gosh, probably going on 50 years now. I worked over 40 years for the government on infrastructure, environmental services, and a lot of cleanups in rivers and river restoration projects, as well as large sewer and other big projects that I'm not going to go into now, but I've been involved in a lot of capital programs, and I think it's important to get all the information out there. I really had 4 things that I wanted to bring up, and one was, I talked about an assessment earlier, asked questions, and having done those for large infrastructure projects for the city of Portland and other, Seattle and other places, it's really important to accurately address everything so you can figure out where you spend your money on your assets, and for the state to be able to continue to manage things, both their hard infrastructure and restoration projects. It's really important to get all that out there. So I think that's important. The piece that follows that, I think, is the funding. And, I've heard some of the funding numbers, and they're way too low. It's, it's really tough when you see people build things and then not allocate the money to restore them. The state of Oregon OTIA Bridge project's a good example of an organization trying to do catch up to get all the bridges up to standards. And I hope that OTFW and us through lobbying, our legislators and that can get the money there. But then the part that goes with that, I think, is the partnerships where I think we need to be using the newest science when we redo the hatcheries and the green infrastructure so that it meets the needs. And things have changed over the last, 100 years roughly since a lot of this has started. And I think that should be worked into things. I think each one of these partnerships, the education piece is huge. People talked about the brood stock programs earlier where the kids get to see how fish actually go from eggs to fry. And I think anything that ties our younger people that are living in a more urbanized environment to seeing what's out there. That's one thing that fishermen and people that are hiking and that see out there is that we see how the environment fits together. We see what happens when pure storm water is dumped into clean rivers and we see fish gasping for air. And so I think it's education. It has to really be part of that. And I think these newer hatcheries can have those elements. We see that in some of the facilities out there. Bonneville Dam has some of that. And so I think those are really important things as climate becomes a bigger issue for our children who think that people our age have really neglected it. And maybe we have, but I think getting these partnerships with the different groups as we move forward is really, really important. And then the brood stock programs, I think, are also really important where our hatcheries are not, a fish that they're fish that come from the river that are kind of being helped out. Because as all we've seen is that we have these big swings in temperature and stuff. And as much as I would like to see them go away, I think that it's a cycle that we're in right now. And I think it's important that we have something to maintain the species. You look at how the sockeye returned to some of the upper rivers and up above the Columbia, and you can see what good things can happen if they're managed right with the new science. So those are a couple things that I'd like to put out there. The other thing that I think is really important is that the state doesn't have the money, and I'm hoping they allocate that. But I think you're going to need a lot of volunteers to kind of help, whether it's providing education at the hatcheries or helping on these different panels you have. And I think I would encourage everybody rather than just to comment and watch. I think it's really important that we all, pull up our sleeves and help once a plan's been developed, help that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I see a caller whose phone number ends in 60 online with the hand up. Would you like to come off mute and reveal yourself and your comment or question? Potentially not.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and move to next steps? We have one final slide that just has next steps.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we got you. Yep, go ahead.
Yep, sorry. Hi there. My name's Jacob Mikolite, born and raised on the Oregon coast. I'd just like to ask a question about taking the funding from the Hatchery Research Center and moving that to the Salmon River and turning that into a hatchery research center itself, where we can keep that hatchery still going. Because that facility up there has a landslide that keeps threatening to wipe it out. Instead of worrying about that, using the funding from the Hatchery Research Center and moving that to the Salmon River Hatchery.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in our agency recommended budget, we, within Fish Division, had a budget shortfall of about $8 million. And that's even with a fee increase. So assuming that the fee increase actually happens next session, there's still an $8 million shortfall. And that's a function of several things: rising costs, inflation that you've all been seeing, litigation costs, et cetera, et cetera. And so in our agency recommended budget, the proposal was to actually, we've taken a temporary pause of that facility. And as Seth indicated, we've moved operations to an OSU facility. And a lot of the funding that was associated with that, the license funding that was associated with that, we're proposing in this budget to sweep that as part of the reduction package. And so there wouldn't actually be any dollars to come out of OHRC to go to Salmon River because it's been taken as part of that $8 million reduction package.
Okay.
And if we don't do that, then we would have to eliminate something else, like another hatchery or monitoring or bios. So there really is not many places to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I really hope that we can push to get the funding to keep those going. That way we keep our youth involved, their future generations involved with fishing, because without that, without hatcheries right now, as we all know, climate change and everything else, it's going to be a problem keeping fish returning. No matter how much stream restoration we do, it's important to have those right now in places, as we all know. Well, hopefully know. So just hopefully we can push to keep and do whatever we can to keep whatever hatcheries we can open. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. We wanted to leave you with next steps so you know what's coming next in the process. First, if you have not visited the department's website, I would encourage all of you to do that. The entire webinar series that took place in August is posted. All of these large group meetings are posted. This one will be posted as soon as the recording is ready, but the prior two are already posted. All of the notes from the small group meetings are posted. So really it's the place to go if you need information. And then all of the contractor reports are either already posted there or will be, as Chris indicated, as soon as they're available. Additionally, tomorrow, the survey that we talked about will be posted online, and that will be open until November 26th. So I would encourage you to go there and have others go there to complete the survey. And then we had given you the list of the upcoming reports and actions. I would just stay engaged, pay attention to information that's available about when the department will be before Ways and Means, and just sort of those are the next steps going forward. So I would encourage you to stay engaged, pay attention to the website for updates and opportunities to stay involved. Any questions about those opportunities or anything else as we wrap up today? Really want to thank everyone for listening to each other. It's fascinating to hear all of the perspectives from across the state. I feel really lucky that the department has devoted this much time and energy to listening to all of you, and I feel really lucky to have been the person with Kellen kind of receiving this information and writing about this and helping the state find a path to move forward. So thank you for your time and your energy and your perspective. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean to close.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. And I just want to echo the thanks here for all of you that came here today and have participated in the last two meetings here back in, I think, July, August. I know it's a lot of time out of your days. And then folks online too, it's tough sitting through 6 or 7 hours online. I did it last week and I was pretty knackered after lunch. So really appreciate your time and engagement on this. Do hope you'll engage on the survey and share it with your colleagues and friends. That'll be another way for us to collect information that can feed directly into our roadmap. And then I'm sure there'll be ongoing conversations with a lot of you, you know where to track me down, and feel free to reach out if you want to talk more. So thanks again, and a big thanks to Callan and Teresa for facilitating through the last few months on this. It really took a lot of the load off Chris and I. We're not professional facilitators and not really versed in that process. And I think it's helped provide channels for all of you to engage with us. And then thanks to Chris and Scott and others on this process for helping populate all the information that we've been sharing with you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice work, Sean. Thanks.
One quick question. How soon will the PowerPoint and recording be up? It will be on ODFW's website when it's ready, and I assume a couple days, maybe? Yeah. Tomorrow? Okay, tomorrow. So look tomorrow at the website.